Well, good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Harry Klinkhamer. I'm the Historical Resources Manager for the City of Venice, Florida. And I'm excited to be invited to be part of this season's Betty and Tagliata lecture series as part of the Sarasota County Centennial in 2021. And today I'll be talking to you about the community of Woodmere and the lumber industry that grew there, a community that unfortunately is no longer with us. So I'm going to take you back actually into the early to mid 19 teens, where in World War I, or at least World War I is taking place. The U.S. is soon to get into the war. So during World War I, there was a shortage of lumber in Europe. As you may know, there was a lot of trench warfare that took place, and those trenches needed wood to kind of like the framework to keep that steady. And so a lot of it was gone in Europe, and the hardwood force in the northern parts of the United States had already been depleted in the late 19th century for construction and expansion westward. So companies were now looking south for more timber resources. And Florida, Georgia, Alabama, these states provided an opportunity to find more timber resources. So interestingly, during this time, there were men called timber runners. And what they would do is they would actually be hired by companies to go out and scout for timberland. That could then be turned into lumber. And one of these timber runners is a gentleman by the name of Herman Klug. It's Kluge. He's from New York, and he's hired by a company called the Southern Investment Company. And I'm going to get to them here in a moment. Klug heads south for the Southern Investment Company to find land, and with a lot of acquisition of property going on in Florida, he heads down this way to see what might be available. And he falls in love with, at least from an economic standpoint, an area of land roughly from south of the small rural community of Venice, Florida, all the way down to Charlotte Harbor. In what was back then Manatee County and DeSoto County. Sarasota and Charlotte County's not yet been created yet. So he would recommend this land to the Southern Investment Company, and his wife would come on down, and the two of them, or I should say at least Herman, would be heavily involved in the initial planning and development of this area for development for timber. Interestingly, as a side note, Herman Klug and his wife would later move on to Argentina to do more timber running and scout for timber there, and then would eventually end up in the Philippines in the mid to late 1930s, just prior to the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. And sadly, during occupation, Herman is killed fighting the Japanese. And interestingly, Anna continues on fighting with the Philippine guerrillas in the jungle until MacArthur's famous return and the freeing of the Philippines from Japanese occupation. She would eventually come back to this area, to Inglewood, because she and her husband had done a lot of buying and selling of land and property, and she still owned quite a bit in the area. She would go on to become very active in the local women's club and also in the Republican Party here in Inglewood area. She does eventually pass away at the age of 77 in 1962. So back to Minnesota and the lumber company. So Minnesota Lumber Company began in 1915 with the Southern Investment Company I talked about, who were headquartered out of Baltimore, Maryland, and Richmond, Virginia. So they acquired these lands in Manatee and DeSoto counties that I talked about. Most of this land, interestingly, had been owned by Bertha Palmer and Joseph Lord, two large names of landholders in the area at that time. And of course, the resource that they were interested in was the virgin longleaf pine. Like I said, timber resources up north had been pretty much depleted, and southern timber now was seen as the new hot timber commodity that they were going for. The Minnesota company starts selling off lands for farm lots and for house plots as well. They're envisioning not only just a timber industry, but a resort community as well. And a couple of the board members are going to be Charles Strohmeyer and Lancaster Williams. And those names are going to keep popping up here during my presentation with some of the other businesses and companies that enacted business in the area. So the Minnesota Land and Timber Company is created from the Southern Investment Company with Henry Strohmeyer and Lancaster Williams as board members. So this is now going to be the company that's going to be overseeing the development of the acres and acres of land that had been acquired. Now, as I said previously, this is south of Venice and down to Charlotte Harbor. So in order to be able to build and develop the community there needs to be access to the area. And more than just by boat, they need to have another means, especially if they're going to be hauling heavy equipment down for a lumber mill. So a new corporation is formed, the Gulf Coast Railway, with Henry Strohmeyer, Charles Strohmeyer, and Lancaster Williams all sitting on the board of that corporation. The purpose of this company is to create the Gulf Coast Railway, which was going to connect from Venice, where the Seaboard Airline Railroad ended, down to Minnesota, where the lumber company was going to be built. They ran into challenges, one of which being attempting to cross Alligator Creek. That proved to be complicated from an engineering standpoint, which delayed things. But eventually, they are able to build the railroad and use this train then to bring supplies and heavy equipment and machinery down to Minnesota. The railroad would continue to be used for bringing lumber out of the area to larger markets, and also for bringing workers up to Venice and Sarasota for shopping and enjoyment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit further on in the program. So the Minnesota Lumber Company, they've acquired the timber rights to about 78,000 acres in this area between Venice and Charlotte Harbor. As I mentioned, Charles and Henry Strohmeyer, they're on the board of this lumber company. So built with an initial investment of $1.5 million, the mill starts operation on April 11th, 1919. The factory is operated by 4 125 horsepower boilers, 2 350 horsepower steam turbines, saws operated by a separate 250 horsepower steam engine as well. So there's a lot of power and a lot of energy required to operate this mill. Its peak capacity was 200,000 board feet per day, which would require clearing about 40 acres of timberland each day just to accomplish that. At one point, the mill employs about 400 men for this operation. Crews would go out into the woods, logs would be cut and dragged on wagons, where they would be loaded onto small gauge railways that would be temporarily built into different sections of the timber that they owned, so that they could haul it back over to the lumber mills. Just like the meatpacking industry was often quoted or known to be said that for the pig they'd use everything but the squeal, Minnesota Lumber Company touted the fact that they used everything but the smoke when processing the lumber in the Minnesota area. Logs would be taken to a second-story incline of the mill, where they were met with saws and directional levers to move them through the process of becoming lumber. Shorter logs were used to create wood shingles and box crates. 4 kilns were also built on site to season the wood. Stubs would not just be abandoned, but would be tapped for turpentine. And a lot of this lumber would end up getting shipped actually to the West Indies, including box crates that would be sold to Cuban farmers. They actually did have a crate factory built on the premises as well, where they built the crates and shipped them to Cuba. Then they formed this organization, this conglomerate, formed the Minnesota Cattle Company, owned by Lancaster Williams's bank. So they went and used the cutover land for cattle ranching and planting of citrus groves. So they built about a 30,000 acre ranch on some of the land that had already been cut over and was no longer usable in terms of timber for the industry. And like most company towns and most industries, there were a lot of peaks and valleys with the economy and the market. There would be times where the mill would be running about 20 hours a day. There would be other times where there would just be one shift operating at a skeleton crew, and it would be so dependent upon market forces as to its success. So what was life like in Minnesota at the time? Well, the population peaked at about 1,500 people living there. They had a sewage system and their own waterworks. They had fire hydrants to help protect from fire, being that it was a lumber town with a lot of wood available. The town included a commissary, administrative offices, a bank, and even an ice house. The town they built included bungalows for families. Homes had water and electricity with a cesspool in the back. This was considered part of their sewer system. There was also a boarding house and dormitories for a lot of the single men who labored at the mills. The company would rent out their houses for about $3.50 a week to the families. And repeatedly, you would see during peak times that they'd be advertising in newspapers as far as Tampa, looking for skilled laborers to come and work at the mills. Minnesota was a segregated community. It had 2 movie theaters, 2 schools, 2 churches, one for the whites and one for the blacks who worked for the lumber company. During Prohibition, whiskey smugglers forced the company town to place curfews on the residents and keep employees in and moonshiners out by fencing in the town. Whiskey had become such a problem, starting fights on Saturday nights, that they barricaded the community to keep the moonshiners from sneaking in through the jungle land and the timberland to sell their wares. So the Minnesota Lumber Company, owned by the Minnesota Land and Timber Company, ends up selling the mill to Schroeder Mills and Timber Company out of Milwaukee in 1920. This company, interestingly enough, has Lancaster Williams on its board as well. By 1921, lumber prices were plummeting again, but this time heavy lows. And in fact, the company, because of this and the fact that they were running out of lumber, they were harvesting the trees, they were not replanting. That was not part of the procedures and operations of the time for sustainability. So having not replanted their lands after harvesting the timbers, they were running out of resources to harvest. By October of 1921, the commissary closed and the Minnesota Lumber Company went into receivership. Included in that was the mill, the electric light plant, 2 general stores, the entire town of Minnesota, a crate factory, and other auxiliary plants, along with thousands of acres of timber. Part of the plan was to reorganize as the Woodmere Lumber Company as the Minnesota Lumber Company went into receivership. By October of 1922, a year later, The post office has now changed its name from Minnesota to Woodmere, as that was the new name of the lumber company created where Minnesota was. By 1923, the planing mills unfortunately burned to the ground. Fire trucks come as far as Sarasota to try and save that part of the mills. But still they continue to operate. But at this point, where they were once at a capacity of 200,000 feet a day, they're now producing approximately 50,000. However, they are still advertising for men to come work at the mills, even at this limited capacity. By 1925, Woodmere was acquired by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, who are the ones who had acquired the lands of Venice to build that as an investment community for themselves. By 1928, the end for Woodmere is near. During that time, a windswept grass fire destroys one of the boarding houses, a regular home, and a bunkhouse. And a few months later, another grass fire destroys the mill and 6 more homes. By 1932, the Slobum family was hired by the Nakati Lumber Company, which now owned the property, to be the caretakers of what remained of the community. Homes started moving away to Inglewood, Placida, and as far away as Castee and Siesta Key. There are, to this day, still 35 structures that were eventually relocated or destroyed, the last ones in 1938. So what's the legacy of Woodmere to the community? There are still place names like Woodmere Park that acknowledge and recognize this once thriving community industrial town that was here. Today, nothing still stands on its original site from the Woodmere Lumber Company town. There are still ruins that are buried behind vegetation on private property that are unfortunately not accessible to the public. But the name of Woodmere still lives on in many ways, including the Woodmere Park, Woodmere Apartments Complex, and interestingly enough, one of the railroad engines, I should say, from the Gulf Coast Railway, its bell was salvaged in receivership and moved on to Bertha Palmer's Eagle Point community, where it served as the dinner bell, bringing guests into the clubhouse for their meals. Today, that bell stands outside the Venice Museum and Archives, and I encourage you all to come visit and ring the bell for yourselves. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.